Heresy, crusades, and rivers of innocent blood. While it may sound like a 40k novel, in fact, today we're going to be looking at a fascinating piece of medieval history, the Béziers Massacre. In the late 1100s, a growing number of priests and clergymen were starting to ask some very dangerous questions in southern France and northern Italy, raising concerns like, how could the God of the Old Testament be the same as the God of the New Testament? The God of the New Testament was all about peace and loving one's neighbor and turning the other cheek. Meanwhile, the God of the Old Testament was, well...
The Lord rained down burning sulfur on Sodom and Gomorrah, says Genesis.
And the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and mind in Jesus Christ, says Philippians.
And the city shall be accursed, even it and all therein, to the Lord, says Joshua.
Now the Lord of peace himself give you peace at all times and in every way, says 2 Thessalonians.
When you have taken the city, set it afire. Do what the Lord has commanded, says Joshua.
This was only one of many problems that the priests in southern France were having at the time, and they began to take on beliefs that were drastically different to the established church. They essentially boiled down to there have to be two gods, the God of heaven and the God of earth. The God of heaven is good, and the God of earth is Satan and is pure evil. Therefore, everything on earth is sinful and must be rejected. That means they rejected wealth, any form of possessions, all earthly pleasures, wink, because humans are evil and therefore making more humans is also evil. They believed in a version of reincarnation where sinful souls were cursed to return over and over again until they lived pure lives and they would finally be admitted into heaven. It was an interesting take on Christianity, to say the least, and more importantly, it was heresy to the Catholic Church. Especially during a time when the papacy was starting to see heretics in every corner, in the same way that after you see a scary movie, you start to think there's a monster lurking in every hallway, the Catholic Church was in a bit of a paranoia phase of their life. They had become obsessed with ensuring that all Christians in all lands believed the same thing, and they had kind of good reasons for doing so. In a land before the internet, general literacy, and mass communication, it was easy for a fringe priest to go off their rocker and start giving some truly unhinged messages from the pulpit. And that's exactly what they saw boiling up in southern France. They saw priests who had lost their minds and were leading their flock straight into the pits of hell. This is obviously bad for a church. And for the sake of convenience, we're going to call all of these heretics the Cathars, meaning the pure ones because of their refusal to take part in a sinful world. And side note, we could talk on hours on end whether or not there was a full Cathar church. I'm of the opinion that there wasn't, but for the sake of convenience, we're going to refer to all of these heretics as Cathars as one mass collective. All right? Cool. But the situation was just as political as it was religious. This region was more French light than full-on French at the time. France, as we know it today, was still a growing power and really hadn't secured its hold on the region yet, and the people of southern France didn't really like the French. While the French crown would have really liked to tighten its grip on the region, they were a little busy with their favorite hobby of fighting the English at the time. So when Pope Innocent III reached out to the King of France and said, "Hey buddy, king of the most Catholic state of all of Europe, my guy, can you do something about those heretics in the south?" The king responded, "Sacre bleu, baguette, baguette," or something, I don't speak French. Essentially, he said, "I'm a little busy fighting the English at the moment to be bothered with a few wacky priests in the south, so figure it out on your own." Without any other options, Pope Innocent III sent a few representatives to southern France to negotiate with the most powerful local lord, a man named Raymond VI. Please note that there is a terrifying number of Raymond lords in this region, and keeping them separate is a nightmare, so just know that for the sake of this story, when you hear Raymond, we're talking about the leaders in southern France. Now, Raymond wasn't a Cathar himself, but he was also not going to bend the knee and betray his constituents just because of their religion. The region was surprisingly tolerant for its time, and he had no quarrel with the Cathars. If they were going to live in peace with one another, who was he to stop them? Well, this was not an acceptable stance to take for the papacy. Raymond was excommunicated, and the church sent several delegations to the region to convert the Cathar heretics back to Christianity. Unfortunately, the leader of this delegation, a man named Pierre, was extremely unpopular. And while Raymond was busy seeking absolution for his lands, Pierre was busy pissing a lot of people off and getting himself murdered by the locals. The Pope blamed Raymond for Pierre's death, and despite Raymond's best efforts to get himself right with the church, things slowly spiraled downhill from there until the Pope decided that peace talks had broken down and it was time for a crusade. Not against Islamic foreigners on the other side of the world, but against Christian heretics in his own backyard. Pope Innocent III promised any who would answer the call a crusader's reward, a free pass to heaven, eternal glory, and of course, gold. Roughly 10,000 men from across Europe answered the call and assembled in Lyons, but nobody was really there to lead them, as most of the political and military leaders in the region were busy with their favorite hobby, still fighting the English. So the responsibility of leadership fell to Arnaud Almeric, whose name I probably just butchered. He was the leader of a local monastery, an abbot, and so he was a man of the cloth, and he was assigned to lead the crusade to southern France. Raymond attempted to negotiate with Almeric, proclaiming that he was a good Catholic, and asked the priest to spare his lands. But Almeric wasn't in the mood to negotiate. He smelled heresy and was disgusted. And so now we come to the meat and potatoes of today's story, a little town called Béziers. Now, Béziers was a nice place, but it was not in a strategically defensible position for the larger campaign. So Raymond promised to send some reinforcements, but couldn't stay to defend it himself out of fear of being cut off from the rest of his lands, and because he was needed to assemble his armies elsewhere. So Béziers was essentially on its own. And while the town had some defenders, they were horribly outmatched by the Crusaders opposite of them. The Béziers bishop came out to meet the invading army and told them that this was a good city full of worshiping and dutiful Catholics. He provided the Crusaders a list of 222 known Cathars and pleaded with them and said, hey, if we give you these heretics, will you spare the city? The Crusaders said, sure, if you can make it happen. But apparently the logistics of turning over 200 of your neighbors to be burnt at the stake was more than what the citizens of Béziers wanted to offer. It's really, really hard to sentence 200 of your friends and neighbors to death. So the bishop pleaded with the Catholics of the town to leave and flee for their lives, but very few took him up on the offer. So the town, with very little leadership, no bishop, and frankly no hope, took up arms to defend their neighbors. It's hard to say exactly what transpired next, but the established story goes that a sortie party of citizens came outside of the town and began to harass some of the Crusader mercenaries. The mercenaries didn't like this, they started a brawl, and the townspeople fell back into the town. But before they could close the gates, a group of the mercenaries wrestled control of the gate, threw open the doors, and the rest of the mercenary party rushed into the city. As the knights saw this happening, they all rushed to begin to assault the city themselves. There was a massive opportunity here, the gates were thrown open, it's time to begin the assault. But as they approached, they had to ask Father Almeric, what should they do about the Catholics still within the city? Were they not all brothers and sisters in Christ? How could they distinguish between who was holy and who was heretic? And that's when Abbot Almeric gave what is reported to be one of the most hardcore replies you'll ever hear from a man of the cloth, saying,
Kill them all, God will know his own.
Which can also be translated as,
Kill them all, let God sort them out.
It sounds like the line out of a metal song, right? Like if the next Sabaton title is God will know his own, I would not be surprised. And while to us this is a hilariously savage line from a monk, it quickly became the horrifying reality for the citizens of Béziers. The defenses were quickly overrun, and the mercenary crusaders began pouring through the streets, ransacking homes and fulfilling Almeric's orders. Terrified citizens sought refuge within the city's churches, thinking that surely holy crusaders would not dare to spill blood within God's house. This was a fatal miscalculation. Every man, woman, child, and priest was slaughtered within those holy halls, regardless of their innocence. While the Knights of the Crusade stood idly by as mercenaries ravaged the city, they apparently decided it was time to intervene when it came to splitting up the spoils of war and claim the entire city as their own. This obviously infuriated the mercenaries. They were the ones that had put in all the hard work of massacring civilians. They should enjoy their share of the loot. And the mercs decided that if they could not have it, then nobody could. They set about burning the city, burning churches, homes, businesses, basically anything of value they could find, they set alight. Apparently, this was a great success. In his report to Pope Innocent III, Emeric boasted, quote, "Our men spared no one, irrespective of rank, sex, or age, and put to the sword almost 20,000 people. After this great slaughter, the whole city was despoiled and burnt, as divine vengeance raged miraculously." End quote. Now, if you can picture your local pastor bragging about these things, you should probably consider switching churches. But at the time, this was a feat of strength, an accomplishment worthy of boasting about. Because if you're going to kill a bunch of civilians, at least get the proper credit for doing so. We should also note that his estimate of 20,000 killed is probably an exaggeration, but the fact that he felt the need to post such a high number in the first place should give you an idea about the church's attitude at the time. Deus vult indeed. Zooming back out, the crusade would last for several more years, as the promise of forgiveness of all sins for 40 days worth of crusading was a pretty popular option for northern Frenchmen, but it was eventually called off so that the papacy could direct their forces towards the east back towards their traditional enemies. Raymond and his son would recapture most of the lost territory from the Crusaders, but after all the fighting, the fully operational French Empire rolled up with its proper, battle-hardened army and pretty much stomped through any resistance to put an end to any dreams of independence that the local lords might have had. There's also one quick caveat that we should add here before we close out for the day. That's that primary sources of this era are very hard to come by. The main body of knowledge that we have comes from Historia, which is a recollection of a Catholic monk named Peter whose uncle was a leader in the Crusade. And while Peter's accounts are generally considered to be factually accurate, there is no doubt that he is biased in his opinions. So while we know that these crusades happened, that armies marched on heretics, and that many were slaughtered, the people that truly knew the details of these events took them to their graves 800 years ago. All we can do now is look back at the shadows they left behind and try to infer what actually happened. It's what makes studying this period so fun and so frustrating, because at the same time, it's all true and none of it is. If you want to learn more about the Cathars and the Albigensian Crusade, go check out the Rest is History podcast, as they're currently doing a deep dive on the whole affair, and I cannot recommend it enough. It's always a fantastic listen with them. I've been Mark, and I hope you have enjoyed. Take care, and I'll see you next time.